Here's a couple of must-have items for your grinder in your job box, guys. So if you're going to go out and take weld tests, maybe go out on your first couple of jobs, you absolutely want to have a couple of cutoff wheels. These are great for fixing places in your open root passes or for feathering tacks, 60-10 tacks especially, because your gap is normally a lot smaller when you're putting in 60-10 roots than if you're TIG welding. Next one up is the 1/8 inch disc. Now this is also going to come in handy for feathering tacks if you're doing anything TIG related in root passes, because your gap's generally going to be a little bit bigger. And then they're really good for 60-10 root passes after you get them in. If you're allowed to use grinders, obviously this is where this applies. You can run this over your root pass at an angle and you can get rid of all of your slag. And next thing up is everybody needs a couple of good flap discs and or tiger paws in their box. These things are going to come in handy basically anytime you're putting a bevel edge on anything, getting it down to a knife edge, or putting a land on your pipe or your plate that you're working with. Those are just really good to have around. The next thing, if you're putting a bevel on something from scratch, instead of using a tiger paw, get you a 1/4 inch disc. Those are super handy. They make different sizes, but those are really good for hogging off material and getting everything prepped and ready to go to where you can hit it with this tiger paw, smooth it out, make it look a little bit prettier. And then one thing that I always keep on hand is a wire wheel, which this one just poked a hole in my finger. That's pretty cool. But I always keep a wire wheel in my box as well, because again, for that 60-10 and or stick welding, just about anything, these are super handy for taking slag off of stuff and just cleaning it up, polishing, and making it nice and shiny. Those are the things that you absolutely should have in your box, especially if you're going out to take a weld test. Guys, don't fret. This is not something that you're going to have to buy all the time if you're working for the same company that say they have a tool trailer, stuff like that. If you go out on a single hand job, you can normally start off with your own personal discs, and then chances are that company is going to have these available that you can replace these with. And normally you'll end up with extras, no matter what happens. Normally you'll have one of these for stainless steel, this will be for stainless steel, and then you'll have another set for carbon steel. You get them mixed up, you need another new set for stainless steel. It's pretty easy to recoup the stuff that you use. Just, don't be the guy that takes way too many. Another pipe welding tip for you guys, especially if you're going to be TIG welding or even running 60-10, it really doesn't matter. But as you can see here, this gap is fairly large. This is set up for a TIG root. One thing you want to always do is, whether you put 4 production tacks in this, whether you bridge tack it, it really doesn't matter. I've been to a couple of places where they did not allow bridge tacks. You had to put production tacks in. So a production tack is basically your root that conjoins the 2 pieces of pipe together. The production tack has to be an existing portion of that root pass. So if you do that, and they require, it's crazy what places will and won't require. So 4 production tacks, top, bottom, left, and right. So basically 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. Those production tacks, after you get those in, you want it to be as square as possible when you start. As you start to weld the tightest gap first. Because if you weld something else on the opposite side, say you weld your preferred gap over here because this gap was a little bit too tight. As you run that preferred gap, that gap that was a little bit too tight is going to continue to close up. The more you weld on this thing and the more heat you put in, the more this is going to shrink together. So make sure when you go to take a weld test, you start off with that tightest gap first. In a perfect world, you'll have one section that's just a little bit bigger than the rest, or 1/2. You're going to want to weld the opposing side first. Weld the tight gaps first, and then your big gaps will slowly start to shrink up, and hopefully you'll have it planned out and set just right to where everything is as it should be in the end. It's a super simple trick, but some people probably haven't thought about it yet. So when you're TIG welding, and you're going out in the field, you're going out and you've got weld tests to take, you've got a bunch of welds to make out in the field after you get on a job, take your tungsten, break it in half. I say break it, that's kind of dangerous. Tungsten's very brittle, and if you just snap it at fragments, protect your eyes, don't do that, it's a bad idea. If you cut these in half or even into thirds, And generally half is the best way to go about it because it gives you the most use out of your tungsten. This one's pretty well half. As you can see, the rest of these I've used a lot. They get shorter over time, obviously. But if you cut them in half, you can sharpen both sides of your tungsten. And then, once you get a good collection made up and you've got all these sharp and ready to go, you can sometimes go like a week without having to worry about sharpening tungsten. Because you've got all of these prepped and ready to go. This side gets a little bit boogered up, whoop-de-doo. You pull it out, you flip it around, you weld with that one for a day. Then, same thing with the rest of these. You've got so many pieces stockpiled up. That's why I like to have a big tungsten holder. I, at one point in time, had this sucker plumb full. I could sharpen tungsten for 2 hours, and then I would be good to go. If I was having a good week, I wouldn't have to sharpen tungsten for a whole week, if not 2 weeks. So, 2 hours to save myself a whole lot of time in the future. Heck yeah. When you're TIG welding, you do not need to feather your tacks where you're going to be taking off. As you can see up here on that top tack, I've got it feathered down where I'm going to be tying into it. I highly recommend feathering a tack where you're going to tie in, but it really is not necessary to feather a tack where you're taking off. If it's super thick on a production tack where you're going to be taking off, it might be alright to go ahead and feather that. You might need that. That might be something that could help, especially if you're not really good at getting that puddle initiated before you start moving. The key to it is you fire up on your tack back here and you run this to the tip of your tack, and you want to have your wire right there ready to go to catch as soon as you get the top of that tack heated up. So that's just a personal preference of mine. Some people like to feather their tacks on both sides all the way around. Generally, where I'm going to be taking off, if it's, like I said, if it's not super thick, I tend to leave it. I just barely bumped it here to get that little bitty fisheye out. But 9 times out of 10, guys, I won't feather where I'm going to be taking off. I just feather where I'm going to be tying in. You might try it, see what you think. It might save you a little bit of time and effort on the next coupon you're welding or test that you might be taking. Walking the cup in a root pass. Guys, it's really personal preference for a lot of people, whether they're going to walk the cup or freehand. I learned how to walk the cup before I could freehand. I'm not saying that's the right way to do it, that's just how I learned. Oftentimes I will hold my rig like so for walking in a root pass. And all you're going to do, guys, when this is a root and you don't have any meat on anything yet, all you have to do is just barely put a little bit of forward pressure in there and just wiggle that cup side to side. You want that tungsten to just cover the edges of your bevel. And as you wiggle across and your filler wire is in there, you're going to go from bevel edge to bevel edge, left and right, and left and right. And if you get your heat down good and you keep your rod in there just right, you will have an outstandingly beautiful root pass. Now, this takes a lot of practice, takes a lot of time. It looks absolutely beautiful. And guys, it's hard to beat walking a root pass in on the top half of the pipe, in my opinion. Like I said, it can just be so smooth and so effortless once you get good at it. If your gap's set right, your filler wire's the right size for your gap, and you got your heat just right, man, it goes in there nice and smooth. So if you're just going left and right, wiggling back and forth with a little bit of forward pressure, this can be done holding the rig way back here. If it's hot, all you're doing is just wiggling that cup back and forth. Put that root pass in there, give it lots of practice, make it something proud of when you walk away from it. Let's talk a little bit about backfeeding when TIG welding a root pass, guys. So the first thing I want to point out is when you backfeed, you do not have to drop it from the complete opposite side of the pipe. Now you can do this. This is something that a lot of people do, and that's perfectly fine. If you can do it and prevent cold wire, which is basically burning off the edge of this and leaving a little portion of that wire behind in your root pass, if you get good enough at it and you can obviously put this root pass in and not leave cold wire throughout your whole root, then absolutely, go for it. That is perfectly fine. One thing I will say about backfeeding is this is how I always do it. I have my wire inside the pipe and it's coming down and it's getting the bulk, specifically for the bottom half of the pipe, it's getting the bulk of that wire inside that bevel edge, or I'm sorry, inside that pipe. So your bevel edges are going to see maybe a third, possibly a quarter of that wire thickness, and the rest of that thickness of that wire is going to be inside this pipe. Now, as you work up to your tack up here at the top corner, You can obviously have less wire in there unless you change your angle. You have to play with that for your tie-ins, but on the top side, you can pretty much leave your wire half and half and you'll be good to go. So down here on the bottom side, like I said, this is technically backfeeding. You don't have to come from the complete opposite side of the pipe to do this. Practice it, and you won't have to feed as much wire if you get your gap and your heat just right. So that's how I've always liked to do it. I've enjoyed it, and it works for me. Let's cover weld positioning. I've had a couple people ask me about welding 5G and or 6G when TIG welding, specifically for the bottom portion of the pipe. So my favorite thing to do when putting in a root pass, personally, is I like to freehand my roots. So if I'm coming up this side of the pipe, generally I'll put my pinky on the pipe, and I can run up this side of this portion of the pipe here. And then if I'm on the other side, over here, it's a little bit more comfortable because I can hold my TIG rig like so, specifically for root passes. This thing will get hot, but for root passes, I will generally hold it like so. You guys can see that, 2 fingers or one of the 2, maybe even just the pinky, depends on how hot this piece of pipe is. If it's root pass on a test, generally it's not going to be that hot, not yet. And I almost always weld my bottom half first. I try to make my gap a little bit bigger on the bottom and give myself plenty of room to put some meat in there. So generally I'll take off right here. I normally put a knee down, and I've almost always got my hand way back here on my rod, and if it's not too hot, you can normally rest your arm on the piece of pipe and you can sit there and you can feed your wire as needed. Now, if you're gonna walk the cup, there's a couple ways you can do it. Generally, if you're just starting out and you're not good at holding your rig way back here, I mean, if you're gonna walk the cup and you're starting off at 6 o'clock, this is what it's gonna look like. Kind of goofy. Just being honest, it's a little goofy. Now I have, and a lot of other people that I've worked with, if you can practice walking your cup upside down, technically, where you're running off the top side of your cup, you can put it right here and you can wiggle your cup, especially for a root pass, but you're not gonna make it very far before this thing is in your face. So keep that in mind. So another thing that I have done too is I'll come at it sideways. Instead of holding it, this is position 1 where I started off right here. The second thing I tried was this. I realized I couldn't make it very far before, obviously my TIG rig was right here in my face, and it doesn't work out very good. So my advice, if you're trying to walk the cup on the bottom side of the pipe, practice holding your rig at an angle down here on the pipe where you're almost resting on the outside of your cup, left side or right side, depending on which portion you're on. And then you can kind of wiggle it back and forth, and you can get quite a ways and practice this. Here's a tip that I'm going to give you that's it's great. It helped me out a lot. Once I finally figured out how to do it, I messed it up plenty of times. Once you get up here to about third way up your bottom half, you can take it, if you can rest your arm on your pipe, you can stand up and you can keep working it. It's not always easy, it can be very difficult, but it can be done. So again, that's the hardest way to do it. Probably the second hardest way to do it, and you can't make it very far with your root pass. So my advice to you is get in here on the side, practice working that cup on the side of it, and that's what I've done if I'm not going to freehand on the bottom side of the pipe. So I hope that helps a little bit. This is something you have to know if you're going to be TIG welding stainless steel. Guys, you see this little bitty pinhole right here? This is caused by leaving the fisheye in your root pass right in the center of your weld when you break your arc. Now, what you want to do to prevent this, because this will bust you on a bend test if they bend it right here and it goes all the way through to the inside of your root, and x-ray especially. If this sucker goes all the way through, which 9 times out of 10 on a root pass, if it looks like that, it's going all the way through your coupon. So what you're going to want to do, if you don't have a foot pedal and you're using the same old machines that you normally would here in the good USA, you won't have your foot pedal. So you're going to take this thing, that fisheye, and you're going to run it up the bevel edge just a little bit. Don't come all the way out to your pipe itself. Run it up that bevel edge and then break your arc. You don't want to be busting weld tests or getting busted out on the job because you leave a fisheye in the center of your root pass and you just break that arc and leave a little bitty pinhole in your weld. Everything else about your weld can be perfect, but if you've got these, you're not going to pass x-ray. Chances are if they bend it on one of these on a root pass, you're not going to pass that either. Don't do that.